Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. Advocates and activists say that civil and human rights are being eroded in the UK, and in some respects, Guantanamo is a marked improvement on the British justice system. That is a disturbing conclusion of our next guest, veteran human rights lawyer Clive Stafford Smith. In his recent article for the Gazette of the Law Society of England and Wales, Clive argues that the once paramount features of the rule of law in the UK, such as the right to a fair and public trial, are being eroded to a frightening extent. In his piece titled Secrets and Lies, Clive describes the story of two innocent men kidnapped, tortured, and detained for at least 10 years without trial. In their attempt to seek justice in the UK court system, these men are currently being forced to endure secret court proceedings in which their legal representation cannot collaborate with their clients on a defense strategy. And joining us now to discuss this case and the alarming decline of the rule of law within the United Kingdom is Clive Stafford Smith. Clive is the founder and director of Reprieve, an organization of human rights defenders who provide free legal and investigative report to those facing state-sanctioned execution, rendition, torture, and extra-judicial imprisonment and killing. Clive is joining us today from New York. Clive, welcome to The Real News.
My pleasure.
So, Clive, your article takes a look at the cases of two men who suffered torture, rendition, and a decade of detention without trial. You then go on to describe how their case is being heard in secret, where they are being represented by a special advocate who cannot even consult with them. So can you please explain for our audience the background of this case and why you've argued that, quote, open justice was a casualty of 9/11, end quote, and how you can compare the UK justice system to that in Guantanamo?
Well, yes, certainly. I mean, let me say first that I've been to Guantanamo Bay 36 times representing prisoners down there. It's not exactly my Caribbean resource of choice, but you know, there are things about that process that are utterly dreadful. And it's really pretty surprising and shocking to discover that in some ways the British system's worse. So what happened in this case were that these two guys, Amanatullah Ali and Yunus Rahmatullah, were seized by the British in Iraq. And the British then, used them when they were captured, then turned them over to the US. At least one of them went to Abu Ghraib. Then they were both rendered to Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, which is really Guantanamo's evil twin sister. It's worse than Guantanamo. And they spent 10 years there with no trial, no charges, no nothing. Now, through this, the British government was being a bit sanctimonious and saying, oh, we don't do this rendition and torture stuff. And then I was in Pakistan and I met Amanatullah Ali's brother. And he said, I don't know what my brother's doing in Bagram. He's just a harmless rice farmer and rice trader. And the more I looked into it, the more it was clear that that's what had happened. He's just a guy who is a rice trader who had been in Iran. And after Saddam was overthrown, it was the first time that Muslim people could go very often to Iraq, to the many holy places in Iraq, and he'd gone there as part of a holy visit. Well, the British got him, and it became clear that the British thought that he was a leader of Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a Sunni extremist organization that's mainly focused on Kashmir. And he clearly isn't. He's got nothing to do with extremism, and he's got nothing to do with any Sunni group whatsoever. We couldn't work out why the British got this so wrong. And the British government kept repeating that he was a bad dude. And it was only when we got him out of there that we finally discovered what had happened. And what had happened was this. Amanatullah had been going to Saudi Arabia and he'd had his passport confiscated because I think he probably didn't pay the right bribes to the right person to get the right visa. So he didn't have a passport. He couldn't do his work as a rice trader. So he did what many people do in Pakistan, which is he slipped a few dollars to someone and got another passport. Now, unfortunately, they gave it to him in the name Ahmad Dilshad, which was the name of this guy who's an extremist leader. But it had all the details wrong on it. And the British got the wrong end of the stick and decided that he was this guy. And that's why he spent 10 years in this awful place being tortured in dreadful ways. And all we're trying to do is to establish what the British did and get them to say those very simple words, I'm sorry, which is so hard to get government people to say. So that's where we are. And then we end up in this dreadful secret court system.
So when we talk about what this man endured, first of all, how long has it been since he was in custody at Bagram Air Force Base?
He's only been out for about a year. And of course, you get kicked out of those places just like you do Guantanamo Bay, without an apology, without anything. You don't even get your sort of $10 bus ticket. And so he's left to try to overcome 10 years of torture with absolutely no help from anybody. And certainly we at Reprieve try to help people under those circumstances, because that's the very least we can do.
So has there been any sort of criminal prosecutions for the torture of this man? Has he been able to be compensated in some way for the years that he lost and certainly what he endured while he was in custody?
One of the extraordinary things about the law, and I apologize as an American lawyer for some of the dreadful rules that we have, is that if you're a government official and you go around torturing people in Guantanamo Bay or Bagram, you pretty much get immunity for what you do. I mean, it's an extraordinary rule, isn't it, that a government official can engage in something that is an international crime and have no consequences. So certainly no one's been prosecuted. In terms of compensation, we have sued the British to get him compensation. And this is where they tip him into this secret court system. And it's a system that they call a closed material procedure. And what they mean by that is that the judge is in there in a secret room with a bunch of Secret Service people, no doubt, but we don't know because I'm not allowed there. And the only person who can speak for my client is what they call a special advocate. And he's a barrister with one of those ridiculous English wigs. And they're not allowed to talk to the clients. So they're in there supposedly representing someone who they've never met. They're not allowed to talk to him. If the government makes some whopping lie up, they can't come back to the client and say, is this true? So it's really an astounding system. And when you think of, what we criticize the Soviet Union for, it strikes me that this is pretty bizarre that Britain has this sort of system in this day and age.
So the British government denied for years that they had any involvement whatsoever in rendition and torture. So how could the judge in this case take in the government's position at face value, given their history of lying?
Well, it's extraordinary. And we've got at least 12 government ministers who have made public statements that we can categorically prove to be false. And what one can only assume is that the government ministers have been misled by MI6, which is the British intelligence service. And so you have this thread of lies, and yet they want to cover up the cover-up in a secret court. And, to me, this very much is the British Watergate, if obviously I don't have to tell you that the big deal with Richard Nixon was not so much what happened in Watergate, it was the lies and the cover-up that came along afterwards. And the fact that to this day, they're still lying about this whole rendition, kidnap, torture process is really the biggest deal to me.
Clive Stafford Smith is joining us today. He is the founder and director of Reprieve, which is an organization of human rights defenders who provide free legal and investigative support to those facing state-sanctioned execution, rendition, and torture. We're talking about the case of two men who were held for a period of 10 years without trial, without consult from their legal representation, and why this is completely legal, at least in the eyes of the British government. Stick around for part 2 of our conversation right here on the Real News Network.